So welcome everyone. I'm Benedetta, president of the Cambridge Femtech Society, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this Cambridge Festival event, The Future of Family Planning, Can Technology Help? This event has been co-organized by Cambridge Reproduction and the Cambridge Femtech Society. So just a few words about the organizers. Cambridge Reproduction is an interdisciplinary initiative at the University of Cambridge that brings together over 200 researchers from across all disciplines to study reproduction, everything from science, medicine, technology, to arts, humanities, and social sciences. Membership is open to all staff and postgraduate students at the University of Cambridge and affiliated institutions. So please see their website, which is now being shared on the chat for more information. The other organizers for tonight's event are the Cambridge University Femtech Society. We are a student and alumni society that aims to promote knowledge sharing and tackle challenges in Femtech. Femtech is the intersection of women's health and technology. Please see our socials that are now being shared on the chat for more information about what we do and the events that we run. So just some housekeeping matters before we begin with the event. This event is being recorded, and a recorded will be uploaded to the Cambridge Reproduction YouTube channel. Please keep your microphone on mute during the presentations. We will start with a short presentation by each of our speakers, our 4 speakers, and then have a Q&A discussion session where you can ask them your questions. Please put any questions or comments that you may have in the chat box. You don't have to wait until the end, just put them there as they come to mind. If you would like to ask a question in person, then please use the raise hand function, and the chair, who is Valentina, our vice president, will ask you to unmute yourself. Please be aware that if you do so, you agree to be included in the recording and in the YouTube video resulting from this event. Also, contraception and fertility can be an emotive topic, and we ask you all to be respectful in your comments and questions. By joining this event, you have agreed to abide by the Cambridge Festival Code of Conduct, which really boils down to just being a nice person and respectful of the speakers, the organizers, and all your co-attendees. And we'll share a link to the Code of Conduct now in the chat. So before we begin with the presentations, we would like to break the ice with some polls for you, our audience tonight. When you think of family planning, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Try and think of an image in your head, and I'll give you 2 seconds. Okay, and now, Christina, could you please share the poll? And, you know, vote which of these options is something that came up in your mind, if there are any that reflect your thinking. Okay, I can see the votes coming in. Right, over 50% of you have already voted. I see that there's definitely some more popular ones. Right, shall we show the results? Okay, so interesting to see contraceptives closely followed by just a baby. And then good that nobody said nothing comes to mind. We'll see how if your image changes by the time that we finish with this event. And then another short question. Which of these options, just to try and get to know our audience a bit better, describes you the best? Right, we seem to have, I think we can just give it 5 more seconds and okay. We can share the poll results. So we've got many students, some academic researchers, and also members of the public, some people from the femtech industry, I imagine. So great to have a diversity in our audience. And so that was really nice. If you want to pop in the chat where you're listening from, is it from the UK, which city, or if elsewhere abroad, like please let us know. It's always nice to see how far-reaching our events are, how they can, So let's now move on to introducing our speakers and panelists for tonight, whom I want to thank for finding time in their busy schedules to be here. So I'll introduce in the order in which they will present. So Dr. Caroline Rusterholz is a Wellcome Trust Research Fellow at the Faculty of History and a College Research Associate at St. John's College. Her research project is supported by the Wellcome Trust and uses the history of Brooke Advisory Centers as a case study through which to reassess the history of teenage sexuality and of the anxieties it caused in post-war Britain. And she's also the author of Women's Medicine, Sex, Family Planning, and British Female Doctor in Transnational Perspective, 1920-1970. Thank you, Caroline, for joining us. It's great to have you. Then it's my pleasure to introduce Rob Milnes, that has been guiding Wiel HealthTech as CEO for the last 14 years. And he has over 24 years experience in women's health medical technology. Wiel HealthTech is a global digital health company which bases in the UK and US that offers solutions for the complete women's health journey. Rob will tell us how their OvuSense fertility monitoring products have been helping women be in control of their fertility and their broader vision for managing women's health in the future. Then we've got, so it's great to have you, Rob. Hello. Then I'm introducing Dr. Lucy van de Wiel, a lecturer and director of postgraduate research in global health and social medicine at King's College London. She's also the coordinator in the Wellcome funded collaborative research project Changing Infertilities, which is based at the Reproductive Sociology Research Group at the University of Cambridge. She's the author of the book Freezing Fertility and was also featured in the documentary Freezing Fertility. And then our final speaker and panelist for tonight is Frederik Petursson Madsen, the co-founder and CEO of Circle Biomedical that develops Wiel. Wiel is a completely new approach to contraception that works by topically engineering cervical mucus to provide effective contraception with minimal side effects. So thank you very much for being here today with us, and we look forward to learning from you. Now, without further ado, I give the floor to Caroline, our first speaker, who will tell us about her research in relation to today's events theme. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the organizer for having invited me. So my aim today is to give you a brief overview of how the development of certain contraceptive technologies and their prescription were intertwined with ideas about who ought to reproduce, meaning how prejudices around class, race, and age influence the testing and prescription of contraception. I will first give you a brief overview of the development of contraception in general, and then focus quickly on two forms of contraception, the pill and the injection Depo-Provera. So until the end of the 19th century, methods for controlling fertility ranged from withdrawal and abstinence to diverse substances ingested or placed into the vagina, to barrier methods such as the cap, pessary, diaphragm, and male condoms. But with the advent of the birth control movement in different countries, birth control activists actively tried to encourage birth control research. As a result, the first half of the 20th century brought the development of chemical contraceptives as well as new intrauterine devices. But these contraceptives were either unpleasant or unreliable. developing a cheap, easy-to-use, reliable contraceptive became a key target for birth control activists from the interwar years onward. While some activists were trying to free women from the burden of pregnancies, others were convinced that birth control was essential for eugenic reasons, namely to prevent what they called undesirable populations to reproduce by controlling their breeding. These undesirable populations were the mentally and physically defective, according to the terminology of the time, those living in extreme poverty, and some immigrant women. So after the Second World War, and with the fear around overpopulation, research into birth control became more widely funded. The pill, Christina, can you change the PowerPoint slide, please? The pill was invented by scientists in the 1950s who tried to find ways of creating synthetic steroids for treating a range of maladies. Margaret Sanger, the famous US birth control activist and eugenicist, got in contact with one of these scientists, and thanks to her network, enabled him to conduct research. Enovid, as you can see on the picture, the first contraceptive pill was tested first in the US on involuntary psychiatric patients. Then further clinical trials took place in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was the perfect location to conduct such trials because birth control was legal since 1937 there. And there was a high level of poverty and a population boom, which means that there was a tradition of government-led programs to control this population boom by pushing women towards sterilizations as a method of birth control. As a result, women from rural parts of the islands were actively targeted and encouraged to undergo sterilizations, and this program was endorsed by the US government. So starting in 1955 in Puerto Rico, the pill clinical trials were conducted on hundreds of poor women. These women were not aware of the practicalities of the trials. They agreed to receive the medication since they knew it prevented pregnancy, but they didn't know the medication was tested on them and that this medication had negative side effects. About 70% of the women in the studies complained of nausea, dizziness, headaches, stomach pains, and vomiting, while 3 participants died. The deaths of the women were not investigated, and Petursson, the scientist, conducted this trial. This means the women's complaints are psychosomatic. So Enovid became available across the US, but in Puerto Rico, the pill was too expensive, and therefore poor women who had served as guinea pig couldn't afford it. As a result, sterilizations continued to be the main form of birth control. By the 1970s, 1/3 of the women in Puerto Rico were sterilized. Coercive sterilizations and fertility control still endure in the US today. Some US immigration and custom enforcement facilities perform mass hysterectomies on immigrant women. In California prison between 2006 and 2010, nearly 150 women were sterilized, and these women testified that they felt pressured to do so. So coming back to the pill, the latter became available on the British market in 1961 on prescription for medical reasons, and at first mainly for married women through private agencies such as the family planning clinics. Unmarried women and young women were not deemed responsible enough to use the pill at first. After the Family Planning Act of 1967, the pill became available to all women, regardless of their marital status, on medical prescription. So while the prescription of the pill is considered a watershed moment in women's history, looking closely at its development shows that its clinical trials were characterized by a lack of consent, a lack of true informed choice, and a history intertwined with eugenics idea about who should reproduce and whose body were perceived as disposable. So a second example, Christina, where race and class influence the prescription of contraceptive technology is that of Depo-Provera, a hormone shot developed in the US. Initial trials showed adverse side effects such as blood clot, sterility, irregular menstruation, and cancer. Although this contraceptive was banned by the United States Food and Drug Agency, major international family planning agencies supported Depo-Provera in more than 80 countries. While not yet officially approved by the British Medical Commission for routine use as contraceptive, Depo-Provera was beginning to be prescribed in Britain in 1976 on a short-term basis, providing that women gave the consent and were informed about its side effects. But historical studies have suggested that immigrant populations were disproportionately being given Depo-Provera. The feminist and obstetrician Wendy Savage conducted a study in East London in 1978. She showed that the majority of patients who were offered Depo-Provera were of Asian descent. In Scotland, this contraceptive was mainly prescribed to poor working-class women and single mothers in family planning centers. So this contraceptive was also prescribed by the sexual and reproductive health charity Brooke. So in 1977, the Brooke Medical Advisory Committee reported in a meeting that members of the women's movement were concerned about the use of Depo-Provera in immigrant women. Evidence gathered by these activist groups shows that the drug was prescribed mainly to Black, Asian, and working-class women, and very often without their formal consent. So the meeting of the Brooke Medical Advisory Committee emphasized the responsibility of doctors to make sure that potential clients understood the treatment and had given their consent. In this context, Dr. Faye Hutchinson, a book doctor in London, mentioned that a small number of West Indian girls at the London Brooke had chosen Depo-Provera. She didn't provide any information of the reason for these girls' birth control choices and the criteria on which doctors based their decisions to suggest this method to the girls in question. And no mention was made of white clients using this method though. So this raises the question of the extent to which assumptions about race were a key factor when assessing whether to offer this method to clients. Indeed, it may have been the case that young West Indian girls were deemed to be at high risk of unwanted pregnancy due to their alleged irresponsibility in failing to protect themselves. This potentially evidenced racial prejudice in the prescription of Depo-Provera. Moreover, in 1981, the Brett Community Health Council, one of the most multicultural councils in London, condemned the use of this contraceptive by stating that, I quote, "The use of Depo-Provera comes out of an approach to healthcare which accepts uncritically ruling assumptions. In this instance, the desirability of reducing the Black birth rate and the assumed ignorance and unreliability of Black women." Similarly, led by the Brixton Black Women's Collective and the Organization of Women African and Asian Descent, Black feminists argued that racialized stereotypes informed the contraceptive method prescribed by white doctors. So today, Depo-Provera is still widely used and prescribed. In Israel in 2013, there was a scandal after the release of a documentary that showed that Ethiopian women who sought asylum in Israel were given Depo-Provera while still in transit camp in Ethiopia, some without being told that they were being given birth control, and many having no idea of the side effects. Some women said that their immigration status was dependent on whether they accepted the injection. When they eventually arrived in Israel, Israeli doctors continued the Depo-Provera treatments. So to conclude, reflecting on the history of contraceptive technology helps to highlight how important it is for today's scientists and sexual health counselors to recognize that prejudice around race, class, and age have informed and continue to inform the scientific development and prescription of contraceptive technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. That was great and perfect to start with an insight on the history of family planning technologies. To now move on to our next speakers, was working on sort of the opposite end, looking at the future of family planning and new technologies that can empower families and women in their health. So I hand over to you, Rob, for the next presentation. So Rob will be telling us about how Wiel Health is using evidence-based technology to aid the health and fertility journeys of women. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you very much. So I've only got one slide because getting to the panel discussion would seem the most interesting thing for me. But firstly, I'm Rob Milnes. I've been in women's health, as Benedetta said, for 24 years and really got involved in it, having already spent 6 years in medtech because my wife and I struggled to conceive. And the company was started with a technology from Bristol University. 2 veterinary scientists were looking at ways of looking at very minute changes in temperature in cattle at the time. In fact, that was around about the time of the foot and mouth outbreak. And as a result of that, they patented this new technology for looking at minute temperature changes, both for in the bovine world, but also in the human world. And they landed upon the idea of looking at ovulation. And as people probably know, we've been looking at temperature, what we call basal body temperature, for over 200 years now for determining whether or not a woman might be ovulating. And in essence, what we're doing with temperature is following the track of progesterone throughout the reproductive cycle. So when progesterone rises, temperature rises, and there is a progesterone rise associated with ovulation. By looking at it more closely, what we're able to do is not only detect when ovulation has occurred, but predict that it's going to happen as well. And that's really the core technology that we have. We've launched 3 products since we started the company, the first of which embodies this technology from Bristol University, which is a vaginal sensor that's taking temperature readings to 1,000th of a degree resolution overnight. It takes about 100 temperature readings. The user takes the vaginal device out in the morning and downloads data to their mobile phone. We have a specific app for this. And then the mobile phone gives an update of what's happening throughout the cycle in terms of when ovulation will occur and whether it has occurred or not. And then we launched a clinical version of this product that has flagged various cycle characteristics that occur that we've published on. So we've published over 10 clinical papers that identify various cycle patterns which are atypical and help us to understand more about issues such as polycystic ovarian syndrome and endometriosis and the onset of menopause and miscarriage risk. And that's really where the company is now moving to. So we used to be called Fertility Focus. We've just changed our name to embody that idea that we're moving much more towards helping women over their entire health journey with specific issues like PCOS and so on. As I said, we've published 10 clinical papers. We've got 10 granted patents, and we've recorded over 200,000 reproductive cycles now from women, largely those that are struggling to conceive rather than those that conceive easily.
Thank you, Rob. That is great. And also to learn about the amount of data and research that your company has done alongside delivering value for all the women and families that you have helped is really interesting. And hopefully we can talk more about that later on in the discussion. But so let's now move to our next presenter and panelist, Lucy. Lucy, I hand over to you. Lucy will present her incredibly interesting research on, I guess, how societal factors and fertility technology intertwine and influence each other. I think I hope I do you justice by saying this, that you look at the intersection of many different areas of life together. Lucy, over to you.
Thank you, Benedetta. You certainly do. So as Benedetta said, my name is Lucy van der Wiel. I am the future of family planning. No, I'm not, but that's the name of the event. Thank you for being here. Let's just see if this works. So we've already covered this. I'm a lecturer at King's College. I focus on global health and social medicine, and also work in Cambridge, where I was a researcher for the last 6 years before I started last year at King's. in the beautiful research group called Reproductive Sociology Research Group, or ReproSoc. And like Benedetta said, my research focuses primarily on ideas about fertility and how they change in relation to new technologies, in relation to politics, in relation to various ideas about what it means to age and so on. So we will get back to that later on. So I was asked to give a short presentation introducing myself, so I've focused on that. So my major topic that I've been working on has been egg freezing, so freezing one's eggs so you could potentially have children with the frozen eggs later on in life. I wrote a book about this, which you can also see here, which is available open access, so you can read that for free if you'd like to. And there's also a documentary that was made about this this book and was inspired by this research into the changing ideas of fertility in relation to the possibility of egg freezing, which you can see here, and it's available on YouTube, but I'm also going to do something more exciting with that, so we can share the link for that later. Some of my more recent research, besides the egg freezing, focuses on extending the IVF cycle. So not only extending the reproductive lifespan with frozen eggs, but also extending the IVF cycle itself with so-called add-on technologies. So you see here some examples. So for example, this one is called time-lapse embryo imaging, which is a technology that films the embryos and then uses the visual information to predict which embryo is most likely to become a baby. The one next to it over there is genetic testing of embryos, also called pre-implantation genetic screening, also a key technology. And linked technologies to that are, for example, giving intended parents the opportunity, if they go through IVF, to watch videos of their embryos developing with time-lapse embryo imaging, or to use artificial intelligence tools to analyze the datafied visual information. So those are just two examples of add-on technologies that are very widespread in the IVF sector at the moment, which are widely available and receive a lot of attention and investment, particularly also by the key players in the field, the large pharmaceutical companies such as Merck, the large genetic and biotechnology companies are all focusing on this broadening out what IVF is and what kind of technologies are involved with IVF. The UK regulator has some concerns about the development of introducing additional technologies within IVF. So they have introduced a so-called traffic light system, which shows the amber, green, or red color of technologies based on the strength of the evidence base. So the issue that the regulator has with these technologies is that some of these technologies might not have a strong enough evidence base, according to their experts, in order to make a difference in the live birth rate. But still, intended parents would have to pay extra for their IVF cycle to include them. So there's a lot of discussion about that at the moment in the sector, about whether that's a good development or not. Is it a good idea to foster innovation and to give patients as much autonomy and choice over their IVF cycle as they would like to have? Or is it important to protect patients against potential conflict of interest if technologies are being introduced and, at least according to the regulator, the evidence base isn't strong enough to make a case for an improved live birth rate? So with some colleagues from the University of Manchester and University College London, I've just published something about this. I think it was, last month. Although this is a pre-proof, the final version came out last week, I think, or today, in which is based on the analysis of the discussions about this topic with clinical medical directors in the UK. And we discuss how they view this discussion around add-ons and what it tells us about more fundamental questions about what it means to practice medicine and how that changes in relation to the introduction of new technologies and new ways of organizing the IVF cycle. And that leads us to my third focus point, which is financialization. So while the discussion in relation to add-ons has partly something to do with the question of commerce in medicine and to what extent clinics make a profit by selling a service or selling a technology, and whether that is something desirable or undesirable in relation to reproductive health care. Financialization is something slightly different, in which the investment isn't so much about the selling of the service or the product by a clinic or by a related organization, but about the investments in the clinic themselves, and that the buying and selling of clinics, of IVF clinics, becomes the activity of the analysis. And so financialization is something that is relatively recent in the IVF sector. So you see it primarily in the last 10 years that IVF centers are increasingly being bought by outside financial investors. So the capital market is getting interested in IVF. These are just some examples from last year of private equity investors buying fertility clinics, including the first fertility clinic in the world, Bourne Hall, which is near Cambridge, by the way. This is also specifically egg freezing is an area with a lot of new investment. So here are some examples of egg freezing related companies that have received a lot of investment recently. So we see, alongside the traditional IVF clinics, the increasing development, particularly in the US, but also in the UK, of new startup companies that focus on egg freezing. There's some examples here, or financial products in relation to IVF and egg freezing, such as insurance products, as well as loans for fertility treatment. So that's an interesting development. So I've been speaking with some investors and with medical directors and with embryologists and with consultants to see how they view this development and what it means for changing ideas about fertility. I've written 2 papers about that, so if you're interested in these, the top one just came out recently. This one is about particularly fertility insurance, which was more discussed years ago when Apple and Facebook started offering women the opportunity to freeze their eggs and pay for it in 2014. This is, since then, has become quite widespread. Now over 3 million people are covered in the US. And so I describe that development in the top paper. And then the lower one is more specifically about private equity and egg freezing and how it changes our ideas about fertility. So if you, all of those are open access if you're interested. But now for something fun in relation to that. And I think we'll have a chance to discuss all of these topics in the discussion. So I don't want to take up too much time, but I want to invite everybody who's interested in reproduction, particularly those of you who work on reproduction, whether you're a student or whether you're a researcher or you work in the field more broadly, to the Reproduction Salon, which will happen on the 25th of May at 6 o'clock in London, near Waterloo Bridge in central London. And it's basically going to be a Zoom antidote, because as lovely as it is to be on Zoom and to connect with people all over the world, I feel like after over 2 years, we also deserve some time to come together, have a drink, get to know each other, and be present with each other and talk about reproduction and all the projects that we're working on. So this is going to be our view. It's a rooftop terrace. It's going to be glorious. And I'm also going to organize a screening of the documentary, which you are invited to. So if you're interested in attending either of these events, which will be free and in London, please sign up. Christina will share the link in the text message, and I will keep you updated and send you an invitation. So that's me. This is my email address in case anybody would like to get in touch, has any questions after this session. Do send me a message. I'd like to get to know all of you, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Lucy, and great to see how you've looked and talked about different aspects of fertility. I think talking from our society perspective, we have quite a number of members that are always interested in knowing about investments being made and what sectors of femtech. So it's probably be interesting to also explore that later on in the discussion. And now over to our final presentation by Frederik. So over to you, Frederik. We're really looking forward to learning more about the work that you do and how we aims to revolutionize non-hormonal contraception. So please, over to you.
First of all, that was an amazing presentation. I need to figure out how to do that. I have a very normal, boring presentation, but just to introduce you to the company, what we're doing, my background. So just briefly on myself, started working in contraception about 7 years ago. And it really started with my girlfriend at that time, who came to me and said she didn't want to use the pill anymore because of the side effects. And I think me, as many other guys, weren't very aware of that. But it didn't take long before I realized I wouldn't use hormonal birth control. A lot of her friends were talking about the same things, and I got more and more curious. So it's really, that's a background. So I got, more and more curious, seeing what could be done, what has been done historically. Met a researcher at a Danish hospital who interviewed more than 1,000 women about contraceptive needs, really confirming at a larger scale there is this frustration about the lack of alternatives and a really strong desire for something new, something ideally without hormones. So that's the background. Really believe that contraception is primed for disruption. And one of the reasons we think this is when you actually go out and talk to users, understand what is the perspective on contraception. So we did a study with more than 1,500 women in the US. And one of the questions we asked was, what do you think about hormonal contraception? And we see 49% saying it's either extremely or very important that their contraceptive doesn't contain hormones. What's interesting is you see only around 14% using non-hormonal today, because for most, there is no viable alternative. You have condoms that are very effective when used correctly, but in most cases, they're not. It's a male-controlled method. You have the copper IUD, which is highly effective, but also highly invasive, has quite low adoption. Then you have these fertility awareness methods. In theory, it can be effective, but it's quite cumbersome to use. So difficult to actually achieve efficacy. You have spermicides, not very effective, also typically causing irritation. And what all these products have in common is that they are around 100 years old. If you look at the technology, we know the pill hormonal contraception is around 60 years old. And if we zoom out, the problem is quite obvious. If you want high efficacy, you will also be having quite severe side effects, either from a systemic treatment of hormones or from an implant that causes irritation, inflammation of the uterus. On the other hand, the products that are less invasive are not very effective. So really the idea was, can we find a technology that can enable a product that allows women not to compromise when it comes to contraception? So my background is in business innovation. So I'm not a biomedical researcher. So my idea was really go out, understand how would the ideal product look like, and then try to find a technology that could enable that. So I spent around 2 years talking to different researchers, trying out different ideas, trying to see if there is a way to solve this problem. I met a researcher in Stockholm, who's today the scientific co-founder of the company, working on mucus engineering. So the idea, quite simply, is that we reinforce the natural barrier, which is the cervical mucus. And throughout most of the menstrual cycle, this is actually a very good barrier to sperm cells. It's really only on and around ovulation that the mucus loosens up, allows sperm cells to swim through. So what we're doing is we're delivering small polymers that interact with the mucus, change the microstructure of that mucus to prevent the sperm cells from swimming through the mucus, reaching the egg, and thereby preventing fertilization. And with this approach, we really think we address 3 things that are unique about contraception. So the first thing is that users of contraception are young, healthy, which really means the side effects are unacceptable. What we're doing is we're just modifying that naturally occurring mucus layer. It's a non-systemic local treatment. So the whole idea from the beginning was we need to find a technology that's as minimally invasive as possible. Then the second aspect is when it comes to contraception, you need something that's seamless, convenient, ideally unnoticeable, and just works easily. That's also what we try to achieve. So we have a capsule, you insert it, it's well designed. We really focus on interacting with the user, and everything we're doing is really based on understanding the user and what would be the ideal product from the user perspective. And then finally, it needs to be really effective. That's also the problem if you look at the non-hormonal products that are out there today. So final slide, just to tell you a little bit about the science. So this is an example of the kind of data that we have. So we have an animal model in the control, which is untreated animals. We have about 50% of the animals getting pregnant once you do artificial insemination. None of the animals have become pregnant when we are treating. So this is a group of 30 animals. Then we do a control experiment. We remove the biopolymer from the gel that we place vaginally. Then you see again, high number of pregnancies. We then also try to benchmark against a known product, so a spermicide. There we see a few pregnancies, which also represent what you see in real life in women. The spermicides have a contraceptive effect, but it's not very strong or good enough. So that's introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederik. That's great. And also thank you for sharing your data from your animal studies. And we're really looking forward to learning more about your technology and how the whole idea came about, that's working with the mucosal layer. So now we go into the panel discussion, and for this, Valentina will be moderating. Valentina is the Vice President of the Cambridge Femtech Society and a postgraduate student in bioinformatics and reproductive developmental biology. So Valentina, thank you, and over to you. I'll be also keeping an eye on the chat. So if you have any questions or you want to ask them, just raise hand or drop them in the chat. Thanks, Vale.
Thank you very much, Benny. And I see that we already have a couple of questions in the chat. And as Benny was mentioning, please feel free to keep writing them as they come to your mind. Or if you would like to ask your question live, you can just raise your hand and we will call you. I think the first question that was asked was for Lucy and was about egg freezing. And Christina is asking if when you, I guess, do you want to freeze your eggs, does it always involve a hyperovulation? And she's wondering if that would mean jeopardizing eggs that would be naturally available in the future.
Hello, Christina. Thank you for your question. So usually egg freezing involves hyperstimulation. So that hyperstimulation for those, or not hyperstimulation, but ovarian stimulation, in which you would inject about once a day, sometimes twice a day, hormones in your belly with an injection needle in order to stimulate the ovaries to mature more eggs at the same time. So that normally you would have 1 or 2 eggs that mature fully at ovulation, and then in IVF or with egg freezing is similar to IVF, you would stimulate more eggs so that when you have the eggs extracted, you would have more mature eggs normally available than you would have otherwise, and thereby potentially increase the chances that you would conceive with them when the time comes. It's not strictly necessary. There's also clinics that do egg freezing without ovarian stimulation or with mild ovarian stimulation. That's also called more like a natural cycle IVF and natural cycle egg freezing. In that case, you would have fewer eggs. And so there's different medical opinions about how much that would affect the eventual success rates. So it is possible, but it's generally standard practice is to do stimulation. Now, it shouldn't, either way, it shouldn't affect how many eggs are available to you in the long run, because the idea is that every month you would have lost those eggs anyway, the ones that that you would normally ovulate if you hadn't done egg freezing, are the ones that you then stimulate with the ovarian stimulation are the ones that are already maturing a little bit. So every month you have several eggs that mature a little bit, but usually only 1 or 2 that mature up to the point of ovulation. And with ovarian stimulation, you mature more eggs at the same time, but those eggs would have disappeared anyway. So it shouldn't make a difference in the long run for the number of eggs that you have. it's more like you could more consider other risks that are associated with the egg freezing procedures. So the risk of infection, for example, or the risk of hyperstimulation that could affect your general reproductive health. It's not very common, but it is a risk that is shared when people freeze their eggs. And so it's good to discuss with your doctor in case you are considering this, what the risks are if you undergo a procedure like that. But it's not the number of eggs that you would compromise with egg freezing.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for the very exhaustive answer. And I think then and Christina, thank you as well. The following question that came in the chat was for Frederik, and I think it was about your animal study and what animals exactly you used in the preclinical trial that you've shown. And I think I'll tag along another question as well that we had with the members of the society. We were wondering, you said that most of the final product as we see it now is because of the active user engagement and feedback that you receive. And so we were wondering, how many iterations did you actually go through before developing the final product, and how were you like overcoming the obstacles?
Yeah, thank you. So regarding the animal model, I can't be more specific than just saying it's large animals we were using. Regarding the development, it actually started initially with an idea of temperature tracking. So that was before natural cycles was in the market and some of these app-based ideas. So it's pretty much the same as natural cycles or some of the other companies. So the reason why I pivoted away from that was just doing interviews with women that were actually using that method and talking to them, realizing that for some it works, but for a lot it doesn't work because it's quite cumbersome. There's a lot of factors influencing your temperature. For a lot, it's also difficult to predict the time if you have an irregular cycle. So it became pretty clear it's the right problem to tackle, but that wasn't the right solution for it if we really want to create a breakthrough in contraception. Then the next was focusing on, again, that it should be minimally invasive. So maybe looking at if there's another way of creating a diaphragm. So I started looking at, is there a possibility of redesigning that, different materials, different design? It's kind of in that process, I then was introduced to Thomas Crocher, who's the co-founder. Went to meet a researcher working on a bioengineered silk that could be an interesting material for a diaphragm. Thomas started presenting his research, and then became kind of obvious that instead of adding a new material, we can leverage nature's own barrier, which is the cervical mucus. So from there on, it was pretty clear that that would be like a truly innovative approach and an innovative product.
Thank you very much, Frederik. The next question from Janelle is to both Caroline and Lucy, and she's thanking you very much for your interesting presentations. And then she's asking if you see sociological biases about who should be a parent and who shouldn't seeping in our contemporary understanding of fertility, and especially as it relates to accessing eggs freezing or IVF, for example. So Caroline, if you want to take it first, and then Lucy, you can add.
Yeah, who should be a parent? Well, there's still like many bias based on race and class and age. For instance, teenage pregnancies are still widely condemned, especially Black teenagers. So there's still like racial prejudices about them not being able to be good parents. Black families have been heavily criticized. There is a new book from Dorothy Roberts about the fact that in the US, Black families, like intervention from the state into Black families are horrendous, meaning many families have been ripped apart because of the way that the care is understood, meaning that Black families are not good parents. And in terms of IVF and egg freezing, I will let Lucy reply.
Yes, thank you, Janelle. That's definitely the case. So, gosh, there's a lot of inequalities implicit in IVF, partly depending on which health system you're in and how expensive it is, of course. Like certain countries charge a lot more than other countries, or, depending on whether you have a public health system or a more privatized health system. But also in relation to the history of the research in relation to IVF, there's a lot of a variety on who is involved with that and who isn't. I mean, Caroline has talked about that a little bit, but or actually extensively, but that's also the case for IVF. So initially, IVF was developed to overcome tubal blockages, and tubal blockages are often linked to, say, for example, STIs such as chlamydia, which can cause infertility in the long run if the tubes are closed. And so IVF was a way to avoid the fallopian tubes blockage by taking the eggs out of the ovary and doing the fertilization in the petri dish, and then implanting it into the womb. Now you see over the course of history, a lot of the interest for IVF, and indeed, like the first IVF baby, but was probably in relation to that indication as well. But over the course of time, a lot of interest was developed in relation to IVF as a way of treating age-related infertility. So, and generally, as women get older, they have more access to money. So it was generally the women who were more affluent and the women who were older who could afford and who were accessing IVF. And so you see that a lot of the research and the technologies were then focusing on reproductive aging, which is very hard to treat, but it is one of the things that egg freezing is, for example, an indication for. Now, in terms of more broadly in relation to aging, I come from the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands, when egg freezing was introduced, there were a lot of objections. We had a Christian cabinet at the time, and the doctors who wanted to introduce egg freezing were told they couldn't. There was several parliamentary debates about it because there was an idea that it was very unnatural for women to have children when they got older. Much less so for men who have children when they got older. So there was this sort of normative idea around aging there. And at the same time, you've seen over time that egg freezing has become really popular in, for example, in the US, where there's now an encouragement to freeze your eggs younger. So the idea that it's a good idea to freeze your eggs when you say in your 20s, when you have peak fertility, something we can discuss in more detail later. But it's really interesting when you ask about bias. It goes both directions. It goes towards medicalization and overtreatment, but also the restriction of reproductive choice and the limitations of accessing treatment for women who want to. And both of those are the subject of bias, and both of those are sort of stratified, so linked to categories like age, gender, and race and ability, and so on.
Thank you very much, both Caroline and Lucy. The next question is from Helen, and she's asking, I think maybe Rob and Lucy also, you would be very suitable for answering. She's saying that somebody mentioned rising commercial interests in fertility clinics, and she's wondering what's the situation around investment interest in new or evolved fertility and contraceptive mechanisms. Rob, if you want to take that first.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a difference between investing in clinics per se and which is the service side of the industry, and in devices and new drug treatments. Largely, I think the clinical the investment in clinics is being driven by the desire to try and consolidate the industry to a certain extent, which is a natural product of the fact that it's quite a young healthcare industry. It's only 35, 40 years old. And what inevitably happens is that individual clinics grow up and they want to then get larger. And the only way to get larger is actually to increase the footfall in those clinics. And the easiest way to do that is to buy another clinic. And so you're seeing that generating at the moment. I don't think that's actually creating much innovation per se in the way that clinics operate. I think they're probably getting more professional in inverted commas, and I think they're being better regulated than they were. And Lucy gave a good example of the fact that the IVF add-ons are now being looked at in much more detail in the UK, for instance, and that's true elsewhere. And there's been some trends such as single embryo transfer, which are really important, I think, for the advancement of the science. On the devices side, there's been a big rise, as everybody knows, in the investment in femtech per se, but I think that is only a function of really the rise in investment in tech. So is that because of the development of more devices that are out there? Yes, I think so, but that's because we're more able and more easily able to develop medical devices now on a mobile device. Our device started as a very functional, very expensive thing to make that was a completely separated standalone device, cost about £250 to manufacture. So we couldn't charge anything less than sort of £350 for it. By removing the guts of the device that had to do the downloading, we were able to reduce the cost down considerably to our present device, and therefore make it more available to more people.
Any of the other panelists, would you like to add to this? Okay, I think a follow-up. Go for it, Lucy. Yeah, all yours.
Well, I just wanted to say that we have two really interesting technologies, people who represent those technologies on the panel here. But there's also other projects in relation to contraception that are really struggling to get investments in relation to pharmaceuticals that are have lost their patents. So I think investments are often linked to, obviously the potential for growth and the potential that a particular technology has to be disruptive and to be profitable. And but there are also generic pharmaceuticals that could have other indications that could be used for contraception. But if a pharmaceutical is already on the market and is already available sort of generically, it's very hard to get investments to do research in that. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So on the one hand, getting a lot of investment into a sector can change it, as we're seeing with IVF. Indeed, consolidation is a key factor here, and there's a lot of new ways of creating what are generally referred to as efficiencies that are shifting the practice and the ideas about fertility. But there's also sometimes the lack of investment that can pose real challenges for people who want to do interesting work, but cannot link it to a business model that's going to be profitable, but can link it to a really interesting use case, including alternatives to the traditional oral contraceptive pill. And so that is a challenge that we should also address, that where investment comes from, and how we can do that. And of course, a stigma in relation to any of these topics can have more generic investors be frightened off a little bit. Yeah.
Caroline, you wanted to add something as well?
Yes, just on what Lucy was saying about, pharmaceutical industry not being really interested in investing money to a trial new contraceptive. This is very much the case with the male pill, where there wasn't any investment from pharmaceutical company because they thought the market was already growing very well with women, so they didn't want to invest money in male contraception. And similarly, some vaccines that are now being trials for like male vaccine to try to prevent men from producing sperm, where actually they did the first clinical trial, but then they stopped because some side effects that actually all women face when they have contraceptive pill are deemed unacceptable when it comes to men. So they couldn't find any investment to pursue this line of research. So yeah, it's also very interesting to see how gender plays out in investing into reproduction.
Thank you very much, all of you. And yes, Caroline, we will definitely go back to the male pill in a while, because that's very interesting. I think we've covered like the investors and the investment side of things, but I also wanted to ask to both Rob and Frederik, who are developing new technologies, how do instead healthcare professionals receive, and what do they think about your like new technologies and new products?
You want to go first, Frederik?
Yeah, I can go first. I think in general, in my experience, I think there's genuine excitement about innovation happening because it's clear from the healthcare professionals that are working with contraception, there is great demand for an alternative, and it's a true unmet need. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of excitement. I think it's also very productive if you're working as an innovator to talk to healthcare professionals, to really understand the perspective of the user, what is the unmet medical need. It's also a way to get a much more precise and accurate communication because they come with a completely unbiased perspective on your technology and your innovation.
Yeah, our experience is a little bit different. I think having started with a technology that sounded like something that has been done for, I mean, I think I said 200 years to begin with. I meant two sets of 100 years. So I think the first paper on female ovulation with temperature was sometime in the 1880s. And the first paper that was truly published on it was in a journal in 1904, I think. So it is a natural perception for clinicians to say, well, you're measuring temperature just like everybody else has been doing for this long. There can't be any difference. And so we had an initial skepticism surrounding that, which changed largely when we started to be able to show data. So we were able to show that by continuous monitoring and by monitoring more accurately, we were seeing things that hadn't been seen previously. And that's enabled us to publish these papers, as I said, and largely seeing atypical temperature patterns, which indicate atypical progesterone patterns in women continuously over a number of cycles was a really big important step. And that's why we created a clinical product. So it's a generally conservative profession, gynecology. And I think if we're talking about IVF and IVF clinics, that's a slightly different profession. And it is one where we have the first generation of IVF doctors now actually leaving practice and retiring. And what we've certainly found is that the increase in women coming into the profession and the increase in young women in particular, has made a big difference to the openness to new ideas generally in gynecology, but also specifically within the IVF industry. So we have a much more open and listening audience now. A number of years down the line, 2016 was the first time we released the product in a digital form. It's taken us that long, but we have a more open and receptive audience. But I agree with Frederik. You have to work with the industry. You have to work with clinicians. There's no avoiding that, and otherwise you're not actually delivering a clinical benefit if you don't.
Thank you very much, both. Yeah, I was indeed wondering, if you've seen differences between male and female practitioners in the way that they kind of receive your ideas. But then there's one question that just came in from Ken, who's asking, I think in general, to anybody who would like to answer, with respect to fertility assisted techniques, I can't think of other areas of innovation which so obviously span from healthcare to lifestyle choice. Is it clear where one draws the line, or it should not exist? If anybody wants to comment on that.
I mean, I can, but I don't know if anybody else wants to. I don't know if I speak too much.
Go ahead, Lucy.
Well, I mean, it's a very it's particularly in egg freezing. It's been a long-term discussion about whether there should be a difference between so-called social freezing and medical freezing, and the risk of calling a technology a lifestyle choice, or even the term social, is often used in relation to reproductive technologies where women make decisions about their healthcare, and there is a risk that trivializes the nature of the decision and the nature of the need. So if you freeze your eggs, for example, it is a medical indication that you have age-related infertility, or that you are anticipating having age-related infertility. So to call that entirely social or a lifestyle choice could be in that way a little bit deceiving. The issue is also that it is very much sometimes marketed as a lifestyle choice. So you have for example, cocktail parties in companies where women get offered egg freezing by their employer, or fertility vans where women can have free free fertility tests as a kind of low threshold access to these technologies, and sort of presenting it as a lifestyle that's empowering and interesting and fits your identity as a successful woman. It comes with its own issues, because it can also not give people the full information about all the risks and all the concerns that come with that, but also it can make it sound like it's an option for everyone when it not necessarily is. So, for example, I've been to information events in the Netherlands in public hospitals, which are really, when you talk about egg freezing, it's really about everything that can go wrong. And after the 2 hours of hearing all of that, you're kind of like, oh, I'm not so sure about this. And then I've been to very commercial settings where egg freezing was promoted like, who wouldn't do this? It's the most obvious choice. It's a fun thing to do. It's a great, well, not necessarily fun, but it's a great thing, and it's an empowering thing, and it's going to give you more freedom and more options in your life. Why wouldn't you do it? And so finding a sort of middle ground between the two is sometimes hard. So both presenting it as a lifestyle choice, but also trivializing it as a lifestyle choice. And last thing I'll say is that primarily in the media, especially when egg freezing was just introduced, it was very much framed as like, oh, this is a career women's thing. It's something that women do because they just want to have fun and they want to party all the time. When in fact it comes often from very deep needs or very difficult situations. And all the research into egg freezing and women's motivations for it point to the absence of a partner as the key motivation for egg freezing, more than even a career or even a lifestyle choice as such. It's really about ideas. How can I parent? What kind of family do I want? What's important to me in my life? And how do I navigate that given the limitations of my body? And so, yeah, I think that those are some of the considerations in relation to the lifestyle question.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And I think related to this question, and then I will go to Melanie, to your question in a second, but in the chat, there is a question about, and this is probably also directed to Rob and Frederik and Caroline as well, you'll know a lot. To what extent are women and potential users engaged in sharing their preferences in the development of these drugs, devices, IVF processes, or features of mobile apps? So basically, how much do you take into account what the users actually need and want?
I can start here. So for us, it's really in the DNA of the company. The science is to fulfill the user need. So it's not the science driving what the product will become. It's really, we know what the user wants, and that's what is driving the science. Yeah, so example is, for instance, in terms of delivery, showing different prototypes. That's a kind of the interface you have with the product. So we spend a lot of time understanding how should that look, how should it be packaged, for instance. So that's, yeah, one example.
We have class 2 medical devices, and that means that we are regulated in a way which requires us to involve the user in the development. And, from everything from the safety testing of the device right the way through to what's known as user factors engineering. And without the user factors engineering and proof that we've done it, we aren't actually able to market the device in the first place. So I think, there is a big danger that the assumption that everything, because it uses a mobile app, is the same type of thing and developed just from the whim of an engineer is probably, is a bit of a false assumption. It depends on the classification of the device. It depends how regulated you are. But as a class 2 medical device, we're as heavily regulated as any other diagnostic device on the market, and therefore have to do all of those things. And clearly, it's the best way to develop the product anyway, right?
Historically, it hasn't been always the case that women preferences were taken into account. Also because historically informed consent appeared in the 70s. So when the pill, for instance, was tested, the side effects were dismissed by male gynecologists, male scientists. Whereas it tended to be the case that women physicians would be much more aware of the side effect and would take them into account in assessing which method they should prescribe to women. But historically it was not always regulated that a patient has a central role and a central say in the development of technologies. Really, when medicine shifted towards the patient-centered idea, that then we took seriously patient experiences.
Thank you very much, all of you. We will now go to the live questions. So first, Melanie, and then Benny, you can unmute yourself. I think you can unmute yourself. Melanie, can you ask the question?
Oh, sorry, I didn't have any questions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no. Well, I suppose I just can comment. I'm a GP, and you know, when I talk about contraception a lot, I always offer barrier methods, but no, very rarely have I ever, you know, do people want to pursue that? And I suppose maybe people who are interested in barrier methods go to family planning clinics already. Anyway, that's my observation.
Thank you very much, Melanie. Benny, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so I want to ask a question to Rob because I'm quite interested in this idea of looking at the cycles of very many women, like over the, you know, over all the years that you've been working with OvuSense. And from my understanding, Wiel Health has been really at the forefront of like breaking down this idea of the mythology of like having a normal cycle. So in your view, why is that mythology kind of wrong? And what does, you know, having more data about one's own cycle do in terms of understanding women's health, and also when things go wrong or when things are different from what is considered a norm?
Well, I think the idea of a normal cycle probably comes from the history of the development of gynecology in general from men, it has to be said, because it was convenient to say women were all the same, particularly with the thing that people didn't understand. Now, in fairness, we didn't know when women were ovulating, but we certainly knew how long their cycles were, right? And it's important to say those two things because most of the science, including the NICE guidelines around infertility, still talk about the length of cycles and reassurance of the woman if she has a regular period that she is most likely to be ovulating, in the words of the NICE guidelines. That's a completely different thing from saying that all women ovulate in the middle of their cycle, even if they have regular cycles. And what we've clearly learned, and what has been shown since about the 1980s, and I guess since the advent of ultrasound that really allowed us to identify this properly, is that, as you'd expect, for all women have a very different and individual thumbprint, if you like, or individual characteristic to their cycles. And it's only about 30% of women that ovulate in the middle of their cycle. And the reason that I think it's important is fairly self-evidently, if you're trying to conceive by having sex in the middle of the cycle, and assuming that you don't follow the NICE guidelines of having sex every 2 to 3 days on a regular basis, then you are going to potentially be missing the point at which you're most likely to conceive for the couple. And what we've found, and I think this is now a function of why it's now important, as we're aging as a population that are trying to conceive, when you're in your 20s and at your peak fertility, and you know, so I started back in '98 in women's health, and the average age for a first pregnancy was 25 years old, and the average age is now 31. And that makes a sort of 15 to 20% difference in your fecundity, your ability to conceive as a woman, let alone the male factor involvement. And so that it's particularly important to know when you should be trying to conceive in a cycle. And you know, that's really why we've been trying to break down the myth. And what we've found is that those that struggle to conceive generally have a later in the cycle timing of their ovulation. So 65% of the women that we see using our product ovulate late, that is more than 2/3 of the way through their cycle.
No, thank you. Thank you for the very comprehensive answer. And I hope, you know, the more we look into these aspects of fertility, the more we'll also learn about women's health and fertility health, and how we can better understand our bodies to then make informed decisions, I guess, in any aspect really of this topic. So I'll just like to thank our speakers for tonight and our panelists for the very engaging conversation that we've had in the later part of the event, and incredible presentations to start with. So in the order that I see them on my screen, thank you very much, Rob, Frederik, Caroline, and Lucy. It was great to have you here. Thank you for your time. Also, thanks to the co-organizers, so Christina behind the scenes and Valentina, and to the audience. It wouldn't make no sense if we were here without you. So thank you very much for attending, and we'll see you at our next event, and have a lovely evening, everyone. Bye.